Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. This episode of Amateur Traveler is sponsored by DK Eyewitness Travel Guides. These colorful guidebooks are filled with great information and are one of my favorite guidebooks. I have 25 of them right here on my bookshelf. Learn more at dk.com.
I got my bags packed on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. Looking real good in my passport photo.
Amateur Traveler, episode 458. Today we're very pleased in the Amateur Traveler to talk about volunteer travel with someone who knows a bit about it, the director of the Peace Corps. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into our interview with the director of the Peace Corps, I want to apologize for skipping a show last week, but I was on a cruise ship, and you'll be hearing more about that with next week's episode. I was cruising from Buenos Aires, Argentina to Santiago, Chile, around the Cape of Good Horn and through the Straits of Magellan. And as we mentioned, sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler is DK Eyewitness Travel Guides. And I brought along one of my DK Eyewitness Travel Guides to that South America cruise, specifically to Buenos Aires, and that is the Eyewitness Travel Top 10 Buenos Aires. As I mentioned before, the top 10 guides are small enough to fit in your back pocket, and in fact was in my back pocket as we traveled around Buenos Aires. Quite often you'd see me on a street corner folding out the map to try and figure out exactly where we were as we were traveling in the Boca or watching tango in the square in San Telmo. And I find the top 10 guides are perfect for this type of trip where we had 2 or 3 days to explore the city. So we started with the top 10 recommendations of what to do in Buenos Aires, which included a trip to Colonia del Sacramento in Uruguay, just a ferry ride away. The guide is one of the reasons that we knew to go to the San Telmo neighborhood on Sunday, where they have a big street fair as well as the tango in the square. And so that was one of the highlights of the trip. So you can check out the DK Eyewitness Travel Guides at dk.com. I'm very pleased to welcome to the show Carrie Hessler-Radelet, who is the director of the Peace Corps. Thank you very much for coming and welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Chris. I'm delighted to be here with you.
We do shows on Amateur Traveler probably once every year or two about volunteer travel, and since we connected at the White House Travel Bloggers Summit, it seemed like who else should we talk to in terms of volunteering but someone not only who is the director of the Peace Corps, but you also served in the Peace Corps yourself.
Absolutely.
Now, I have to say, I have a lot of preconceived notions. I have not been in the Peace Corps. And I have this picture of you going in the Peace Corps right after college, as I understood, to West Samoa or Western
That's
Samoa.
right, Western Samoa.
And you're sort of my quintessential Peace Corps volunteer. Blonde, right out of college, young, full of ideals, and you went and served in the Peace Corps. But I'm wrong, right? That is not just what the Peace Corps is about.
No, that's true, because our volunteers range from age 20 to 80, for one thing. So, in fact, our oldest volunteer ever was 86 when she completed her service. So we really are a program for everyone, not just college grads. And you don't have to be blonde to join the Peace Corps, for sure. In fact, it's really important to us that we represent the rich diversity of our country. So we are focusing very heavily right now on recruiting all Americans. And especially, I would say, we're reaching out to groups that we haven't in the past reached out to as much. So that's a big part of it.
And you mentioned that, and that was one of the things that came up at the White House summit that we talked about, that the whole message coming out of the White House for that particular summit was not just that you should study abroad because it's good for you, but that you should study abroad because it's good for the country. I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit, especially in light of the Peace Corps obviously was founded with that in mind, but I think there's a larger program in play right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just start by saying that there are 3 goals of Peace Corps. The first is a development goal, which is that we help build capacity in our communities so that they can achieve their own development goals. And that's probably the goal that most people associate with Peace Corps, that volunteers are going over to help others. But we also have 2 other goals, and those are cross-cultural goals. Our second goal is to promote a better understanding of Americans on the part of people served. And then the third goal is to bring that knowledge and experience back home to educate our own people about the rest of the world. And it's that goal that I think perhaps is least considered and perhaps most important right now, since we live in an increasingly interconnected, complex world where you just have to look at any newspaper above the fold to know that what happens on the other side of the world can have a dramatic impact here in our country. And we need Americans who can speak other languages, understand and appreciate other cultures, manage multicultural teams, and just really be engaged in a global debate. And those Americans are going to lead the future. And so we think Peace Corps is a great way to get those skills. And it's important for our country because we need those people.
Well, important for the country that way, but also important in terms of the bridges you're making. You told a story at the White House Summit about a young couple that went to Malawi.
Yes.
Vic and his wife, whose name escapes me at the moment.
Adrian.
I wonder if you could share that with us.
Sure, it's a great story. It's one of my favorites. It really speaks to the fact that you can never really tell what your impact will be. And also, it's not necessarily what you do or say, but really how you live your life. And so Vic and Adrian are a young couple. They lived in Malawi. They lived in a village, and Vic was a high school teacher, and Adrian was a health volunteer. And they lived in a mud hut. That might be what you think of when you think of Peace Corps service, in the middle of a small village. And every day, Vic would get up and go off to the school, and Adrian would go off to the health center. They had a modern American relationship. So, for example, Vic would help Adrian with washing the clothes or shopping in the market. They would do that together. Adrian would help mend fences, and Vic would wash dishes after dinner. And then in the weekends, they would explore the village. They would ride their bike all over the place. They really enjoyed being together and also developing strong relationships with members of their community. So at the end of their service, volunteers served for 2 years, they were getting ready to leave, and they had a knock on the door. And it was one of Vic's students, a young man who was actually quite quiet. And Vic was a little surprised to see him. But what this young man said to him really was profound. And this is what he said. He said, "Mr. Vic, I've seen the way that you treat your wife, how you treat her with such love and respect, how you have so much fun together. And I just want you to know that when I grow up, I'm going to treat my wife like you treat yours. So I don't know if Vic was a great math teacher. I don't know if this young man now knows a lot more about isosceles triangles, but I do know that his future wife will be really happy that Vic was his teacher. And I think it speaks to the role that volunteers can play, that they are showing that Americans are concerned about human rights and individual rights, that they demonstrate the generosity of the American people and the fact that Americans are interested in learning from others, and that it's not all about us imparting great wisdom to the rest of the world, but rather that we're there to live among other people. And just by being there, our values are communicated.
I want to take you back a little bit to when you joined the Peace Corps.
Great.
So I'm assuming you had some expectations and some expectations that were accurate and that played out the way you thought they would, and some surprises in that experience.
Yep.
So what led you to the Peace Corps, first of all?
I come from a Peace Corps family, and my family is a little unusual in that we are a 4-generation Peace Corps family.
Which I had trouble trying to figure out the math there, because somebody's not fitting into my mold of who I think Peace Corps is, as we talked about earlier, because Peace Corps has been in existence for 54 years, if I got the math right.
That's
there.
right.
1961,
Yeah, exactly.
President Kennedy.
Yes. So clearly I'm not the youngest one. The first one was my aunt, and she was a young woman right out of college in 1964. She joined Peace Corps and served from 1964 to 1966. She was inspired by Kennedy, as were many in that era, and joined Peace Corps and served in Turkey as an orphanage worker. My grandparents, her parents, went to visit her while she was in Turkey and were so inspired by what they saw that when they retired at age 68, they joined Peace Corps. And so that was in the early 1970s, and they served in Malaysia. They taught at a university in Ipoh, Malaysia.
Were your parents university teachers before that, I assume?
My grandmother had been a guidance counselor in a high school setting, and my grandfather was a research chemist at General Motors. In fact, I'll brag on my grandpa for just a moment. He was the first person to document the adverse health effects of air pollution.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So he was a remarkable man, but a chemist, really. He did mostly lab work. But he taught chemistry in college, and my grandmother taught guidance counseling. So my aunt was the first. She was really the second generation. My grandparents, the oldest generation. And then I came in at third. So when we joined, my husband and I served together in Western Samoa. We were the first, actually, at the time, 3-generation Peace Corps family.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah. And we served in Western Samoa. My husband actually was a trained high school math teacher, and I went in as an English teacher, but ended up teaching a lot of subjects. In fact, between the two of us, we taught every single subject in the whole school. I taught English, history, geography, social studies, PE, and music, of all things. I'm practically tone deaf, but I was teaching music. And I can tell you more stories about Peace Corps. I'd be delighted to do that, about my own experience. But then just to finish on this vein, my nephew, so that's the 4th and last generation.
So far, at least.
Yeah, so far, that's right. Served in Mozambique. He was an HIV/AIDS volunteer, a health volunteer, who did a lot of work with people living with HIV. And then my cousin also served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Thailand, so he would have been the same generation as I was. So altogether, 4 generations and 6 members of our family.
And so you went in more inspired by your family's experience than Kennedy's speech, because this is a few years after.
Yeah, that's right.
What surprised you?
Well, one thing, I've never admitted this to anyone, so I can't even believe I'm about to admit this to you, but when I was imagining my life in Western Samoa, we got our packet and it said, congratulations, you're going to be teaching in Western Samoa. So I kind of imagined Gilligan's Island, frankly, only much larger. I sort of thought, oh, goody, I'm going to have a horse and I'm going to ride my horse on the beach, which, of course, is craziness because it's volcanic rock. And I barely saw a horse the whole time I was there. So it surprised me how strong the relationships I developed with my host family. My host family was absolutely pivotal to my experience. And that is, I think, the case of many people. And really, it was my host family that changed my life. And so those relationships, the strength of the relationships that I developed during Peace Corps, which really truly are lifelong and life-changing, that element really surprised me.
And now you talked about getting the envelope. That's of course, this all happened in the mail at the time.
Right, absolutely.
And as I understand the process at that time, you had no idea where you were going to go.
Exactly.
You didn't really even know whether you would be accepted. And that was something like an 8-month process. Do I have that right? From the time you applied till you heard where you're going to go?
It was about 8 months until I heard where I was going to go. It was more than a year before we actually departed.
And that whole process has changed more recently. I wonder if you could talk about some of the different changes that are taking place in terms of, because I think that's what people think of when they think of the Peace Corps, is they knew somebody who served maybe, and they've heard about this process, but it's not the same. First of all, you're not going to be waiting for the envelope. You're going to get an email, I suspect, long before
Absolutely.
that.
That's right. So there are 3 major changes that we made to our whole application and selection process. And it's basically designed to make Peace Corps simpler, faster, and more personalized. People now are used to having information at the fingertips. They want choice. So that's what our changes are designed to do. So the first is choice. Applicants can now choose specific programs and countries to which they can apply. So they can choose a program that best suits their personal and professional goals.
Now, can they request the horse and the beach?
They can request the beach, but not the horse.
Okay. So some limitations, but okay.
Although maybe they'll get a horse when they're there. I would like to say that a lot of volunteers get dogs and cats. The second is a shorter application process. It used to be a massively complex application process. And even in recent years, it's still been massive and complex. It used to be more than 60 printed pages, and it used to take more than 8 hours to complete a Peace Corps application. And now it's a short online application that takes about an hour.
What's the key piece of information you're looking for? I say you, as if you were personally going through every application. That may not be the case. But you or your people who report to you, what are they really looking for in that application?
The most important factor in a successful volunteer is really being open-minded, motivated to serve, and a commitment to developing relationships, open relationships with others. So they're really interpersonal and value-based qualities that we're looking for, because these are people who are going to be living and working in another country for 2 years. They're going to be learning another language, eating food that is just like the people in their community. They're going to be having a lifestyle that's very different from the life they have in the United States.
Right.
And they need to be resilient, they need to be flexible, and they really need to be committed to service, because it's a pretty intense experience that is going to be very tough at times. And so we need people that are highly motivated.
Have you talked to anybody out of joining the Peace Corps?
Plenty of people.
And why? Without naming names, describe somebody who this isn't the right program for them.
Well, if you have very specific and not very flexible goals that aren't consistent or compatible with what we do, that would probably not work well. So, for example, if you were a neurobiologist and you wanted to do research in Kenya, we would not be your program. Also, if we feel that people are rigid in the way they work, they have very...
The way to do things is my way.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Or if we see someone, unfortunately, that seems to not be very open to others, or who may even be bigoted, for example. I mean, our whole premise is that the human family is a beautiful human family, and that we want people who are accepting, not only accept, but appreciate and really genuinely love other people for the differences, celebrate the differences. So if we see someone who is just really very narrow in their perspective about the right way to live or what's acceptable and what's not, we would counsel them against Peace Corps.
Okay. And then you said there was a third change that you've also implemented.
Yes, and that is sort of more transparency in the process. So now if someone applies for Peace Corps service, they know that if they apply by February 15th, that by, let's say, May 15th, they're going to know that they've been invited to the program that they applied to, and they know that they're going to then leave by September 15th. I'm making those dates up, but
Sure.
basically apply by, no by, leave by deadlines. And so it makes the process more like a college application process or a job that you can plan your life around those deadlines.
And you mentioned college application. One of the other things that we were talking about in Washington, or that you were talking about as I was listening, was changes also in some of the financial support. And if I am coming out of college, deferment of loans and things like that. Can you describe some of what's going on there?
Anyone who has a federal student loan can get that deferred. So that's a fairly substantial help to many college students. We're also trying to see if we can get some of the commercial loans to accept the same terms as the federal loans, but that has not happened yet. Let me just say that. There's also another program, the Federal Student Loan Forgiveness Program, which if someone signs up for Peace Corps service and they follow that with a government career, and that's also state and local government. You make your payments to loans that are based on the salary that you make. So as a Peace Corps volunteer making a living allowance that is similar to the community in which you're serving, your contribution would be essentially zero during your Peace Corps service. And then let's say you go back into public service, the amount that you pay would be based on how much you earn. After 10 years, whatever is remaining in your loan balance would be forgiven.
Okay.
And you can learn more about that on our website. Our website has complete information about this, much more information than I know, frankly.
Yeah, and if people can't figure out how to get the Peace Corps website, we'll put a link in the show notes, but it's a smart crowd, so I suspect they'll figure that out.
Basically, Google Peace Corps and you've got it, but it's www.peacecorps.gov.
And then also when I get out, there's a resettlement bonus. Isn't that what it's called?
We call readjustment allowance, and it's approximately $8,000 if you serve a regular 27 months. So I said earlier it's a 2-year commitment. It's actually 2-year volunteer service, but a 3-month training prior to that. So total 27 months. And for every month, you earn approximately $300, and at the end of 27 months, you get $8,000, which you can use to buy a car or go to graduate school, or you can do what I did, and basically I backpacked around the world for 6 months and blew every single penny.
which we certainly appreciate here on a travel show.
Exactly. And a lot of volunteers elect to do that.
Now, when you went to the Peace Corps, my picture is they gave you a language book and a plane ticket, or perhaps parachuted you in and then came and picked you up 27 months later. That may not be an accurate picture.
No, that's not an accurate picture. I think that might have been the way it was in the very early days. But by the time I got there, it was fairly well established, and it's more or less the way it is now. And that is that you go in as a group of other people, Peace Corps volunteers who are going to serve in your country, and you have a pre-service training. And that training takes place in country. Now, when I was a volunteer, there were 25 of us all living in one gigantic gymnasium at a high school for 3 months. That was really lovely, but we no longer do that. Now we have community-based training, and volunteers go off to communities where they are learning language and culture and then a technical skill. We always train them in whatever they will be doing as a volunteer. And that lasts 3 months. And then you go off to your community.
And when you say technical training, we're not just teaching English, we're not just teaching math. So what kind of technical training, for instance, might a Peace Corps volunteer get these days?
Sure. So we have 6 sectors. Our largest sector is education, but we also have health, environment, agriculture, community economic development, sort of like small business, and then youth development. So depending on what your assignment is, you would be trained in those methodologies. So for example, I mentioned to you that I was a teacher. I taught English. Well, my background, my college degree was in political science and economics, so I didn't really know very much about being an English teacher. But Peace Corps is a very rigorous training program that included, in my case, teacher training. So that's what the 3-month training is designed to do, is to give you the language and the cross-cultural and the technical skills that you need to be successful in your job.
If you want to picture some of the best Peace Corps volunteers that you've run across, who would you describe?
There's so many phenomenal volunteers, and every single one of them is different. I'd love to tell you about a guy named Dwayne Matthews. He's a young volunteer that I met. Actually, he also was in Malawi, but He grew up in inner city DC. I believe he was the first person in his family to attend college. He attended university and heard about Peace Corps from a professor. And so he was assigned to be a health volunteer in Malawi. And he went off there. And what he brought with him was, first of all, just a passion for other people. And he was a health volunteer. And what he did is he thought it was so important to engage young men in health, because in many parts of the world, as in the United States, I would say, young men engage with the health system far less than young women. And we also know that in many traditional societies, it's the men who make decisions about health, even their wives' health or their children's health. And so Dwayne got over to Malawi, and he really believed that he needed to engage young men so that they could just really be leaders related to healthy lifestyles. And of course, HIV/AIDS is a big problem there.
Sure.
And what he did is he brought his love and passion for hip hop and graffiti art
Interesting.
with him, and he used hip hop and graffiti art as a way for young men to be able to develop inspiring messages about HIV/AIDS and healthy lifestyles and being good male role models. And he has organized over 200 young men into these performance troupes that go all over Malawi and give public, they do plays, they do musical presentations, they do dramatic readings. They are a phenomenal force for change. And not only are they educating whole communities, young and old, men and women, about HIV/AIDS and healthy lifestyles, but they're also influencing their peers. And that is so important, because we really know that in order for personal change to take place, you've got to hear it from people that you trust. And these young men have been incredible agents of change in their communities. And they did it because they brought, Dwayne brought his passion with him, his love of people, and his interest in communication through hip hop in this case, to Malawi. And so that's just an example.
And as we have a variety of ages, a variety of people listening, I wonder if you would tell us the least likely Peace Corps volunteer that you've known.
First of all, you asked me earlier about what was surprising to me. One of the other most surprising facts was I really thought everyone would be kind of like me. I was a little bit of a crunchy person, in the 80s,
Sure,
Birkenstocks and what have you. And I assumed that all Peace Corps volunteers were going to be kind of like me. But in fact, what I found is that that is not the case. A young volunteer that I met came out of a business background. He was very buttoned up. I mean, he was wearing his polo shirts and we were wearing our flip-flops. And I thought, oh, this guy will never make it. And he was a phenomenal volunteer. And first of all, he introduced some rigor into our program. He was a very rigorous thinker. But I also saw what a great example and role model he was, especially, I think, for young men, that you could have a life in business and still care about other people. And that's, I think, one thing, a message that I really needed to hear, and I think that others needed to hear as well. And he's gone on to be a very successful businessman, and he's an incredible philanthropist.
If there's some group or person out there who you would most like to interest in the Peace Corps, who would it be? What skills or what group, or who do you need more of?
I think one of the most interesting groups that we have applying now are recent arrivals, so people who are new Americans. And one person that I'm thinking of is a guy by the name of Peter Ter, who was one of those Sudanese lost boys, and I'm putting that in quotes. That's what they're called in the news. But
Right.
Peter grew up in South Sudan, and when he was about 3 years old, his community was raided by the Janjaweed, and his father was killed. He was separated from his mother and the rest of his family, and he ended up wandering with a group of boys for 10 years, literally wandering between Ethiopia and southern Sudan. And finally, I believe, if I'm getting the story right, when he was in his early teens, he got to Kenya, where he was at a UN refugee camp, and it was there that he learned to read and write. And he was clearly very bright and highly motivated. And he came to the attention of the refugee workers. And so years later, and he really doesn't know how old he is, but when he was approximately 21, he was selected to be resettled in the United States, and he was sent to Florida. And there he was placed with a family. The family was just incredibly loving and supportive. And Peter, now at age 21, had no formal education apart from classes in the UN refugee camp. So he started to study on his own after work to get a GED. And the way he did this is he would go into local bookstores and he would get a GED preparation book. And he would sit down in an armchair and read it and do the little exercises himself, but he couldn't even afford to buy the book. And he did that for about a year, and he prepped himself up for the GED, and he passed. And he got a full ride, actually. I think the local paper did a story about him. He got a full ride to the University of Florida. He graduated from the University of Florida with honors. And it was there that he met a professor and served as a Peace Corps volunteer. And Peter felt really strongly that he wanted to give back to the United States and he wanted to do something to help others. And he was considering military service. And this professor said to him, well, why don't you consider Peace Corps? And so he looked into Peace Corps and he thought, that would be great. I'd love to be a Peace Corps volunteer. So he applied to the Peace Corps. And the only thing he said when he applied, I am told, is that he wanted to serve in a Muslim country. And our recruiter asked him, well, why is that? And he said, well, it's because the Janjaweed who killed my family practiced the Islamic faith, and I do not want to hate Muslims. I want to learn to love Muslims. So please place me in a Muslim country. And so he was placed in Azerbaijan. May not be the first place you think of, but it is an Islamic country. It's a lovely country. And so he went there and he served there. Actually, he served for 3 years, so he extended for a third year. And he had an incredible experience. He was a phenomenal volunteer, and he was absolutely beloved by his community. He was the first Black person they had ever seen in his community. But what he also said is, I've discovered that the color of your skin is just such a tiny thing, and that really it's the human heart. What you discover is the human heart that draws us together. And he went on to grad school, and now he is serving our country as a member of our foreign service. It's just a wonderful story. And we love to have recent arrivals come. They bring so much richness to our volunteer service and also very much represent the diversity of our country. We are a country of immigrants, and so Peter is one of my favorite return volunteers.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm not sure everybody outside the U.S. realizes that even. We had a Turkish exchange student who didn't like the fact that our high school didn't look like his picture of what Americans looked like, because we live in a neighborhood that's 80% Chinese. So
yeah. Exactly. And we get that all the time. I mean, you started the conversation saying that I sort of perhaps looked like most people would have thought a Peace Corps volunteer looks like. It's very hard sometimes for our volunteers who are diverse, because people do think of Americans as being Caucasian, blonde hair, blue-eyed. And we really feel that one of our most important goals, let's say, is to communicate the fact that we are a multicultural nation and that virtually every country is represented among our citizenry.
One last thing you would like to leave people with about the Peace Corps.
Peace Corps is really an opportunity to grow in so many ways. And it's not easy, it's not glamorous, it's very tough. But it is an absolutely life-changing experience to step inside someone else's shoes. And I believe that there's no more powerful way to grow professionally. And I also believe that for a nation, Peace Corps service is really important. We need to be able to have Americans who can relate well to the rest of the world. Right now, modern media culture doesn't necessarily show a very positive view of the United States. And what we offer is arms outstretched instead of a clenched fist. So I hope people will take a look at Peace Corps if they're interested in having an immersion experience in another culture.
We have a set of typical questions we ask. We're usually talking about destinations like Azerbaijan. We have done a show on Azerbaijan.
Great.
But I'm going to adapt them here a little bit for you. Mm-hmm. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in the Peace Corps.
The amount of time we spend talking about bodily functions or what we eat. We spend an inordinate amount of time talking about food. Mostly crazy food.
This is when Peace Corps volunteers get together?
Exactly. When Peace Corps volunteers get together, they either talk about bodily functions or they talk about the crazy food that they're eating. Raw sea slugs or parakeets or goat eyes or even worse.
Finish this sentence. You really know you're in the Peace Corps when what?
When you start dreaming in another language.
Excellent. And if you had to summarize the Peace Corps in just 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Life-changing experience.
Excellent, excellent. Our guest again has been Carrie Hessler-Radelet. And thank you so much for coming on and sharing with us your love that brought you back to the Peace Corps after, we didn't mention your trajectory, but you were in the Peace Corps as a volunteer and then went off and did a career and then came back to the Peace Corps. So you haven't been there the whole time.
That's right. That's right. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
In News of the Community this week, we heard from former guest Spencer Kwong, who commented after listening to the Little Rock episode that the guests on this episode were great, they were funny and charming. They made me want to move to Little Rock. We were only trying to make you want to visit Little Rock. I feel we may have overachieved in this specific case. We heard from Rolly in Sioux Falls, who said, I just wanted to say I found your show and I have downloaded 60 episodes that I may enjoy. However, since listening to about 30, I started keeping track of the episodes in a spreadsheet. As I pound away on my accounting duties at work, it really breaks up the monotony and makes me dream about travel. Keep up the good work. Thanks so much, Rolly. With that, we're going to end this episode of The Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. Voting has opened up for the Podcast Awards. You can vote daily for your favorite podcasts, including, hopefully, Amateur Traveler, at podcastawards.com. You can follow me at Chris2X, and as always, thanks so much for listening.